keep any questions that you have in the chat section of this webinar. Ian will be going through the chat throughout the webinar to answer any questions as we go. If there are anything specific for Terence, we do have a short Q&A section at the end to ask. Thank you, and we hope you enjoyed today's event. So just a little bit about transparency. If any of you guys are unaware about who we are and what we do, we have been around for about 9 years now. We set out with just one mission goal, I guess, from our co-founders, which was to be the most trusted Microsoft partner in the UK. Now, one thing that we did achieve last year that definitely takes us one step closer to that is that we are now Microsoft's most accredited UK pure play partner. What do we mean by pure play? Quite simply, we do nothing other than Microsoft. So we don't have any Google or any AWS capability. Everything that we do, everything that we invest in, everything that we drive for our clients is a Microsoft-based product or service, which you can see just underneath on this page. All the areas and all the specialisms that we have, a few to kind of kick off really, and I suppose that work around this area is around security. So we're also a MISA partner. Actually, it's the finals of the MISA Roundtable event in San Francisco, I think, is going on this week. Yeah. And we are one of very few select partners globally that have been nominated as one of the top MSSPs in the world. So hopefully by tomorrow, or even at the end of the day today, we should be announced as winners. Fingers crossed. And then also modern work. So anything around adoption and change management, where Terence sits, anything around information security, etc. But yes, if you do have any further questions about transparency and what we can do, then sure, reach out and one of us will be able to answer any questions that you have. Over to you, Terence.
Thanks, Adam. We're going to start with the poll. So the poll, we're going to ask whether Copilot's security considerations is currently holding you back from proceeding with Copilot, or whether you're pretty confident on your security posture and how Copilot will impact that. So if I could ask you to please vote on that poll, and then we will display the answers on screen shortly. So I'll just give everybody a minute to complete that. And what we're going to cover in the rest of the session, as you can see from the agenda, is we'll be reviewing the mechanics of how Copilot actually works, because understanding that architecture and understanding where data comes from, where data goes to, really gives you a nice visual concept of what are the areas that you need to make sure are locked down and adequately secured. We'll talk about Microsoft's efforts in relation to responsible AI, how they're trying to make the system as secure as possible by default. But of course, as with any activity, there are going to be risks. So we'll dig into what those risks are, how we can mitigate them, and then talk about some practical starting points. So quite a good response on the poll there so far. You can see in the chat, if you've got the chat window open in your Teams meeting margin, you'll see that the majority, not surprisingly, are folks who are feeling like they need to know more. And so you're in the right place for the next half an hour or so, and then we'll have time for Q&A at the end. So to get started with, as I was saying, we're going to just really dig in a little bit to understanding how Copilot actually works. So with Copilot, we have we've got 5 elements up on screen there. So we've got our Microsoft 365 apps, and we'll be focusing on what that Microsoft bundle of apps which we get in Copilot for Microsoft 365. Although quite a lot of what I'm talking about here applies to building your own Copilot with Copilot Studio. So we've got the apps that are bundled in. It's your core Office applications like PowerPoint, Word, Excel, Outlook, which has now recently got its Copilot button back. Yay! It's Teams, it's OneDrive, it is Whiteboard, it's Sway, it's most of the core Office apps. There are a few that you need to have additional licensing for. It's not just turned on by default. If you've got questions about that, please do ask. We can talk about them a bit later. We then have the Copilot Orchestrator that sits in the middle. We've got the large language model, and then we've got the Microsoft Graph and Semantic Index. So how these things fit together work as follows. So a user will create a query. So this can be, for example, in Teams chat. There is a chat bot that you'll see specifically for Copilot in Teams. And you can open that up in Yarn, and you can ask a question like, what is our policy about parental leave? How much parental leave am I entitled to? So the question goes to Copilot, and that's the central orchestrator. And Copilot will then perform a search into Microsoft Graph. For those of you who maybe have heard of Graph but are not quite familiar with what it does, very briefly, Microsoft Graph is, as the diagram symbolizes, it is a mesh of information, and it basically captures and documents the interconnected relationships between people and data in a given organization. So Microsoft Graph tracks signals which are generated when you perform an activity. So you send an email, you send a chat, you attend a meeting, you open a document, you email somebody an attachment, as well as organizational information. So who's on the same team, who reports to the same line manager, and it builds this matrix of information that basically lend context to what Copilot can query. Now, from a security point of view, the first thing we have to understand about this mesh of information is that it's controlled by permissions. So we think about OneDrive, for example. You're the only person who's got access to what's in your OneDrive, unless you explicitly share that information with other people. You think about being in a Microsoft Teams team with other people. You're a member of that team. Everyone else is a member of the team's got the same level of access as you. But your membership in the team gives you permission to access the content. So if you are not in the team, you don't have permission. If you haven't been added to a SharePoint site, you don't have permission, unless a specific file has been shared with you. And then you've got permission to just that one file that's been shared. So Copilot really sits on top of this permissioning structure and can only work with information that you have permission to. And the same applies really to your mailbox. So think of a mailbox, which is your Microsoft Exchange email that you access through Outlook. That's only accessible to you. And in fact, Copilot doesn't even work with delegated mailboxes or shared mailboxes. So it can only look at the information that's in your mailbox. And when it comes to Teams chats, you've got to be a member of a group chat for Copilot to be able to work with that stuff. So in that sense, Copilot doesn't really create any additional access. Copilot will not go and look at information that you do not have permission to access. It physically can't do that. Now, the information that it gathers, so remember the original query was, I've asked about what's my entitlement for parental leave, and it will look through all the documents in the intranet, in my OneDrive, everything that it can access using my permissions, and it builds a package of information. Now, at this point in time, this information is effectively in code format. It's not readable by humans. And what Copilot will then do is take that information, which is not readable to humans, and it sends it through to the large language model. Now, at this stage, it also pays to be aware of where our data boundaries are. So everything that is on the left-hand side of that line I've just drawn on the screen is inside my tenant. Everything that is on the left hand of this next line is within Microsoft. So this large language model that we are using to transform the coded reply into something that's readable by humans, that large language model is not ChatGPT sitting with OpenAI. That is a copy of ChatGPT sitting in Microsoft's data center. For customers inside the EU data boundary, that will be a data center in the EU. That is as far as your data goes. So, and that's only if the UK data centers in the south and in the west are over capacity. So when you talk to the large language model, as long as performance capabilities available, it will be a data center in the UK. If it isn't, it will hand it over to a data center inside that EU data boundary, but never beyond that. That's part of Microsoft's commitment to us. So what step 2 is really doing is taking the reply, which is the documents and the data and the chat messages and everything else that it's thinks is relevant to the query. It gives it to the large language model, and the large language model translates it into plain English. It doesn't send it straight back to the user yet. It sends it back to the Microsoft graph for an additional level of security and compliance checks. So this would mean, for example, if there was even just one of the documents that came into the calculation for my original query was marked with a sensitivity label, then any document that this produces or any chat that this produces will inherit that sensitivity label. So if I've got permission to access something confidential, and the answer will then be classified as a confidential piece of information as well. So there's this additional grounding in my organization's security and compliance policies. And then finally, it will give back the answer. So that pops up on screen and says, you are entitled to 2 weeks, or whatever the answer is. So hopefully that's beneficial and helps you kind of get a visualization of where your data is going to and how it's being used. And that will then inform some of the conversations we're going to have as we move along. Now, before I talk about the risks, I just want to preempt some of the most common questions we get by running through the relevant sections of Microsoft's responsible AI. And you can have a look on their website. They've got it's sort of a dedicated microsite dealing specifically with this. But the key things that are going to be relevant for this discussion we're having today are, firstly, the large language models. As I've already mentioned, it's not hosted by OpenAI. It's hosted by Microsoft. It's in the UK data center by preference, and it will only ever go to another one within the EU data boundary. Microsoft's also very for us to understand that they do not retain and use any of our data to train the large language model. Now, there is one exception to this, and that is when your users are giving feedback. So if I had submitted my question to the Teams Copilot chatbot and I get back the answer and I'm not happy, I think it's maybe not accurate, or it's referencing a document that's out of date, every Copilot prompt response has the thumbs up or the thumbs down buttons that users can click. And if I click the thumbs down or the thumbs up and I give my feedback, there's an additional checkbox that you can click, and that checkbox says, is it okay for us to take the information that you used in the prompt, give it to Microsoft, and they can use it to improve the accuracy of the model? So they're not saying they will use it to train the model, but you are going into a situation where you are actually transferring some of that data. And if that data is sensitive, you are now creating a risk. Arguably, it's a small risk, and you would hope that Microsoft wouldn't take some proprietary or confidential information and say, oh, this is interesting, I'm going to put that in the large language model. But hope is not a strategy, as a wise man once said. So if you are concerned about data being used in that way, you can turn off a global setting that basically says my users cannot submit feedback directly to Microsoft. If you turn it off for Copilot, you turn it off for the whole Microsoft product suite. So that is something to bear in mind. And it's basically a two-step process the user would have to do to send information out. By default, your information is not used to train the model in any way. It's also worth knowing, over and above what I've just mentioned, that these interactions between the large language model and your Copilot are subject to the following behaviors and restrictions. So again, Microsoft will say that they are GDPR and EU data boundary compliant. Now, I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to advise you whether that is good enough for your organization or not. If you have concerns where you're not comfortable with potentially some information being sent to Microsoft, even though they promise, they wipe it after each session, it's encrypted in transit, there's no human eyes on that. So they've even gone to the extent of saying all of our other systems, which have human moderators on them monitoring for abuse or illegal activity, we will exclude Copilot for Microsoft 365 from that human moderation. So no human gets to see that data. And when the chat session is either changed by the user, because you click a button to say, I'll start a new chat, or that session expires, then that data is wiped clean. So if you're still uncomfortable with that, then you need to talk to your internal legal team, and you need to seek professional legal advice on, if Microsoft says it's GDPR compliant, why is that not good enough? So that's where I'll leave that with the disclaimer that we're not lawyers. So really, as far as Microsoft's concerned, this whole set of interactions between your tenant and the large language model is as secure as it needs to be. So we shouldn't worry about that. What we should worry about is what's going on here. So, what are the risks? The one that gets the most publicity, and which people talk about the most on LinkedIn from what I've seen, is this risk of overshared data. So that's when you're in your OneDrive, you're in SharePoint, you're in Teams. All of those experiences have that share button. So you can select a file, you can either click share or you can click copy link. And then you can go in and change a variety of settings to control who that link will work for. And then you send the link either by copying and pasting and sending it yourself. Excuse me, I've got hiccups. Send it yourself in an email or a Teams chat, or if you've used the share button, then the system will send that email on your behalf. So we need to look closely at what those sharing settings actually say, because at the moment, the default for tenants, and this will be the setting for you if you've never looked at it, will be that sharing link will work for everyone in the organization, and it will give them edit access. Now, at this stage, and in the Copilot context, I'm not necessarily too worried about whether it's edit or read only. The fact is that link will work for anybody in the company. And this is where the hype maybe gets a bit out of control, because it doesn't mean that file or that folder is accessible to the whole company, because you have to actually click the link. So it's about the people who possess the link will be able to access that file. So if the link is only ever shared to one person, then that doesn't matter. However, you have the risk that link potentially could be shared with anyone. And you've got no control over how that email is being forwarded inside of the organization. So the risk is definitely real. It's maybe not as bad, but it's still pretty bad. The next one is about retained access. This is the one I personally would worry about a lot more, because here we've got a situation where people are not being taken out of SharePoint sites or Teams when they should be, or if you've shared something in your OneDrive, you aren't removing that permission when you should. So, and as an example, you might have a team set up for human resources, and you're storing some pretty sensitive data there, lots of PII, disciplinaries, all that kind of stuff, which you'll be in big trouble if it's shared with people it shouldn't. And you've got a colleague who's a senior sort of team leader, manager in HR, or people and culture, as we call it these days. And that person gets promoted. So they're now chief internal communications officer. The thing is, they're not in HR anymore, but you don't take them out of that team. So they continue to have access, even though their job role doesn't entitle them to that access. So that's what I mean by retained access. People change jobs, but they carry on having privileged access that they shouldn't. I would be a lot more worried about that. Because when a person like that does a Copilot query, it can come back with information that they shouldn't have access to. And that leads into the next point I wanted to talk about, which is, there's no technical term for it, but I call it ripple effect disclosures or splash damage. I've heard someone else call it. And what happens there is, I do a query, and because of how the Microsoft graph works, where we've got these interconnected relationships, and how the semantic index works to try add value through context, you might not only get back a piece of information you shouldn't, but you might get back additional information, because Copilot tries to be helpful. For example, I'll choose something fairly safe here. I did a query recently where I said, what is our Microsoft partner ID? Because I need to use this when I'm filling in surveys and forms and such. And it came back and it said, oh, the Microsoft partner ID is, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I found it in a document called our plans to buy our competition. No, I'm just kidding. The document was called something generic. But the thing is, that might have been a document where even the file name reveals information I don't have or shouldn't have access to. And it then went on to say the file was most recently edited by, whoever. So Copilot tries to add more context and add more helpful information. And if it's pulling this out of data that you don't have access to, it can take a fairly minor security disclosure and actually make it worse. And that's really what the overall concern for me about this is, that Copilot doesn't actually give you access to any more data than you would have had before, because it only works with what you could permission to, but it aggravates the likelihood or the speed with which people might find this information. So this is really the key thing that we've got to be focused on here. So what are the mitigations that we can bring to bear? Firstly, know what Microsoft Responsible AI protections already give you, which we covered earlier on. Something that you could think about implementing, SharePoint restricted search. So this is a bit of a Marmite idea. Some people love it, some people really don't like it. But basically what restricted SharePoint search does is completely turn, well, I say completely, it turns off global indexing. So the way that Copilot works, you have the global index, which is what a lot of people would think of as traditional SharePoint search, but of course it includes Teams and it includes the content you get through Viva Engage and basically the whole Microsoft stack in the cloud. So it turns off that global indexing, but it keeps the individual indexing. So your OneDrive and any file that you, sorry, not any file, any SharePoint site, which Microsoft Graph knows is one of your frequently accessed. So if you ever go into Microsoft 365 and you go to the SharePoint app and you see all of your sites that you've followed, and you see your sites that you visited recently, but there's also a section there for frequently accessed SharePoint sites, which is generated and maintained by Graph. So when you implement restricted SharePoint search, you can still search your OneDrive and you can still search your frequently accessed sites, but everything else is turned off. And then you begin creating an allow list of the SharePoint sites that you do want. And these can be either SharePoint sites that you set up purpose-built, like an intranet or a document management system, or connected to a Viva Engage community, for example, or it can be the SharePoint site that you get when you set up a team in Teams. It covers all of that stuff. So you begin to allow list the teams and the SharePoint sites that you do want people to be able to work with using Copilot. So you can have a curated, known, safe set of SharePoint sites up to 100. So if you're a medium or a small organization, that's a manageable number. If you're on the enterprise scale, one of our customers had a chuckle and said, that's not even going to cover the intranet. So, and that's why I'm not convinced that it's effective for everyone, but there may be people for which it's a pretty good idea. But really, what we should be looking at is making sure our sharing settings are correct. So have a look at your tenant config. If it says the defaults to create a link that anyone can use, you need to change that setting. Well, you probably need to change it anyway, even if you weren't looking at Copilot. You need to review who's got access to those SharePoint sites. You need to look at, on an individual user basis, what are they sharing out of their OneDrives? And I just want to digress on that for a second. Really, we want to we want to start maturing the way we use these tools, that OneDrive is not really for shared workloads. Even if it's just a handful of people, you're much better off, much more controlled, much easier to audit if you create a team for sharing documents between a handful of people. Don't share stuff in group chats, because then the individual files go into individual people's OneDrives, and then it's much more of an effort or much more expensive to get the tooling to go and audit all of those areas. We need to look at information labeling and policies, which can be manual or automatic, but I'm going to dig into that in the next few slides. So similar to the previous webinar, we were talking about redundant, obsolete, or trivial data and how that can really kind of poison the quality of feedback you get from Copilot. That's on our YouTube channel. In case you didn't get a chance to attend that, you can go look at that video and watch that webinar replay. But I want to establish kind of different levels of maturity. So if you maybe are still majority on-prem, you're only just moving slowly into cloud now, you might find that this kind of level 100 describes where you're at. So you don't really have a strategy for coping with this extra risk that Copilot creates. IT support's very reactive. Everything you do is very manual. There's no policies or guidelines on sharing. And anybody's guess what's being shared in Teams. And your JML process, of course, I'm sure this doesn't apply to anyone here, but your JML process is a shambles. So no one knows when people leave or join. And crucially, when they move from one role to another, we're not updating their site memberships. So this is a state that you want to really get out of as soon as you can, because this will create the most risk when you start using Copilots, or aggravate the risk the most. The next level would be where you have agreed some organization-wide policies about where should data be stored, how data should be shared. You've got an information classification taxonomy. So that sounds very fancy, but basically what it just means, whether it's on a whiteboard or in PowerPoint, you've got some structured hierarchical idea of how different security levels for different bits of data are agreed. It doesn't have to be right the first time, but just getting it down on paper, making people, wouldn't say forcing them, but helping them understand the significance and the importance of agreeing to a taxonomy is the starting point. We need to educate users as to what these new classifications mean. You could, at this stage, implement restricted SharePoint search, review those sharing settings and set them at a more conservative and a safer level. And you can also start looking at Microsoft tools like Purview. So Purview will be used to create and deploy labels which users can apply manually, or labels which we can link to SharePoint sites. So everything you put in that SharePoint site automatically gets the Purview label. What does the Purview label do? Well, you can configure the label and the policy that's enforcing that label with additional permissions, which Copilot will respect. And the really key thing to understand here, because you're thinking, well, why should I permission the site twice? But the thing is, when data starts moving, so if I take a file out of a SharePoint site that you don't have access to, and I put it into a SharePoint site that you do, then you can access the file. Sounds logical. But if that move was maybe not properly considered, or it's maybe done maliciously, that creates a security breach. What Purview does is it embeds a label in the file. So when the file moves from the secure site to an insecure location, Purview label carries on protecting that file, So we are bringing down the risk of Copilot finding that file and then serving it to somebody who shouldn't have access to it. Purview can also be used to monitor for sensitive data in prompts. It helps you with e-discovery. In fact, there's so much good stuff that we actually have a separate 3-day engagement that you can talk to us about. It's not Copilot focused, but all the stuff that we do with Purview there goes on to protect Copilot. And of course, at level 200, you'd have a better JML process. And then finally, with level 300, is really taking all of that good stuff from before, making it routine, and trying to automate it where possible. So with the automation, particularly of the sensitivity labels, that will require additional licensing. So the stuff I described on the level 200, you've got that if you just have E3 licensing. And I think on the Entra, you've got to have E2, but I'm not a licensing expert, so you could correct me if I'm wrong there. But really with 300, we're looking more towards automating stuff. And I know that, it's easy for me to say, automate your joiners, movers, levers process. That is not easy or straightforward, but the benefits that you have of how it improves your general security posture will justify the investment, I'm sure. So that's about all we've got time for. I'm conscious we've got 5 minutes left. So for those of you who are sort of looking at all of this and saying, it sounds sensible, but where do I actually start? So you could consider that's restricted SharePoint search. Personally, I'm on the fence, and I think it really highly depends on what kind of company you are, whether that's a good idea. The next thing you have to do, or if you haven't already done it, then make sure you start, or if you have done it, make sure you can align it to the information you're learning about Copilot here, is just having an information strategy that tells you how to classify information. Because once you know how to classify your data, you can begin creating those purview labels. So we've got a few minutes for Q&A. Just having a look through the chat, there's some questions that Ian has answered, and then there's some who, which he's referred to me. I see your point there from Joe Finucane. I hope I'm pronouncing your surname correctly, sir. Will Copilot have access to content in mailboxes but are not configured on your profile? And Ian's answer that to say no, it's only your own mailbox. Don't have a time machine, so I don't know what Microsoft's going to enable Copilot to do in the months ahead. But as of today, it's only your own mailbox. Then a question from Hardeep. Can you provide some clarity on how Security Copilot is priced? I don't actually know Security Copilot pricing off the top of my head. I just know that it is extra. So everything I've been talking about today is covered by Copilot for Microsoft 365. Copilot for Security is a separate offering. This is what cybersecurity teams can use the power of AI to help them query security logs and stuff like that. So we can get someone from the cyber team to get back with a bit more specific detail for your question, Hardeep, but I can't answer it in any more detail right now. More of a comment from Ed Harrison, so thank you very much on that. Good to know that Copilot will not just give people permission from the sharing link. You actually have to possess the link and activate the link to get the permission. That's good to know. And then one more from Dan Carter. How does Copilot work with guest access? Short answer, it doesn't. So if you've got guest access, you've only got access to the stuff that you were given permission to as a guest. And as such, you can only use the standard SharePoint search. There's no Copilot functionality available to guests. So it has literally zero impact on what guests can do. any other questions while we have time? I think probably if you're going to ask a question, please do use the raise hand feature. And then, oh, sorry, I forgot. Because we're in a webinar, your actual audio and video is blocked, so that's not going to work. So I think what we can do is give folks a minute or two to pop any more questions in the chat. We also have a poll. So if anyone's interested in one of our other Copilot offerings, so we have a variety of conversations we can have with you. So yes, we can talk to you about Copilot for security as well. But we have a separate engagement, which is our data security for Copilot, which is run by Ian, who's been answering questions in the chat for us today. Ian is one of our purview experts. So between Ian and our cybersecurity team, we can handle any purview kind of stuff that you are interested in there. We've also got a one-day intro to Copilot. So if you want to know more about what Copilot can actually do and how you would go about building a business case to justify investing in Copilot, we can do that with a one-day workshop. And then on the other side of the scale, we've got our adoption workshops. Now, this particular one, we can run as a funded engagement, which means if you buy enough Copilot licenses, they've got an offer on at the moment up till the end of June. If you buy 150 Copilot licenses, Microsoft will return funding for running a pilot. If you don't plan on buying quite that many, I would still recommend you buy at least 25 licenses, because any less than that doesn't actually track any adoption statistics, and you won't know who's using it, how much they're using it. But in that case, we can still support you in running a pilot with comms and education and all those good change management things. So that's it, folks, for a minute over time. We've got quite a lot of responses coming back through on the poll, so thank you very much for that. Thank you to Adam and Natalie and Ian, who've been supporting in the background, and we hope that you've found it informative. Keep an eye on our YouTube channel. We'll be publishing this video in a few days' time.